of the Civilian Police Review Board. I want to start out by saying thank you to our wonderful vice chair who presided over last month's meeting. She did a fantastic job. So thank you. And also beyond that, we've been in contact on a number of different matters or issues during the time period. I was down, but not completely out in terms of my awareness of what was going on. I do also want to say, especially for our viewing audience, it was announced at our last board meeting that we had a resignation from the board, Mr. Aaron Thomas, and publicly I want to thank Mr. Thomas for his service, on the board. I have received questions, even today, from the press and I stick with you're talking to the wrong person. And so the mayor has decided to reopen the process for applications for this vacancy and maybe future vacancies on the board. I checked with his office today, and there is not a cutoff date. I wanted to make sure about that. I didn't see one in the press release, but that's what I was told. So I would just say to, again, those who might be interested in serving on this board, you would need to really follow the process laid out by the mayor, and it is the mayor who will choose the next person to serve on the board. And as you remember the process, the mayor chooses and then council approves, his choice. This board will not be involved, in that process. That is purely a mayoral function. But again, if you are interested, please reach out to his office. The next order of business would be the approval of minutes from our September meeting. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Is there a second? All in favor, raise your hands, and I'm going to abstain since I was not at the meeting, but everyone else who approves? All approval with one abstention. We're going to get started with the next very important part of our meeting. Certainly have realized in the last 30 to 60 days as we've moved forward with our progress as a board that we are in need of additional training. So we had reached out to NACOL, and I think we've talked about NACOL before, but that's the national organization that really provides support to organizations such as ourselves, to the Civilian Police Review Board, and not to the Inspector General. The Inspector General is a member of another organization. And so we have engaged them for training today. And again, we have to learn as we do this. So one of the things that I realized that I'm like, budget, dollars. And so I will share with the board that in the last few weeks, specifically, and I think the amount is $20,000, has been approved for us, for our training. It will be with the Inspector General since we're not set up to do all of that. And so in addition, I've asked Dr. Jones to really drill down into what type of trainings from NACOL and maybe other places. And I believe I've asked her to look into we would become a member of NACOL, this body would. And so we would have the funds to do that. They do have an annual training, which took place, I think, earlier in September. And of course, we were not prepared to actually go to a training. But there are other options beyond what we're going to have today. And so I am looking forward to the presentation. Are you going to bring them live at this point? Okay. our representatives from NACOL who will be providing the training today. And once we're ready, I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves.
Can you all hear us?
Now we can.
Okay, great. Occasionally your audio was cutting in and out for us, and I just wanted to make sure that you could hear us.
We didn't get that part,
The,
so.
the last thing I heard was you talking about everyone going around and introducing yourselves. I did want to let all of you know quickly that my name is Cameron McElhenney, or Cami, and I am the Director of Training and Education for NACOL. I'm joined today by Jason Wechter, who is a long-time member of the oversight community and a recent addition, actually, to our NACOL Board of Directors. And I'll let him introduce himself as he begins his presentation today. But I did want to let all of you know that I come to this as I sat on a board, much like yourselves, in the late 90s and early 2000s. And learned very quickly that there was a tremendous amount about civilian oversight and police policy and procedure that I did not know. Even coming to the work with the best of intentions, there still was a void of information needed to do the job and do it successfully. And so I've spent the last, I think, almost 26 years now working on how to get the information to boards and volunteers and professional staff of oversight entities that they need to actually carry out the mandates in the most effective and sustainable manner. So I am very honored to be with all of you today. We are very grateful to have Columbus as part of the oversight community now. With that, I will turn it back over to, I don't know if you'd like to all introduce yourselves quickly, or if you'd like us to just jump right in.
Why don't you just jump right in, and then as I'm sure board members will have questions, they will introduce themselves to you when they ask a question, okay?
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen quickly and then turn it over to you, Jason.
Okay, thank you very much, Cami. And thank you all for being here. I've worked as an investigator for 43 years. I got involved in oversight in 1983 when I started work on the first day of operations of San Francisco Civilian Oversight Agency, the Office of Citizen Complaints. And I've since worked at a total of 2 oversight entities, investigative model agencies, as either an investigator or a supervising investigator. And as of last week, I'm now president of the newly established San Francisco Sheriff's Department Oversight Board. So I'm sitting in the same kind of position you are. So let's just get right into this. We're going to talk about investigations generally, and then very specifically with an example case. And I believe that Cami sent you the handout about characteristics of a good versus a bad investigation. And so I'm just going to go through that very quickly. And if you have questions about any of those points there, please interrupt me and jump in. I'd like this to be as participatory as possible. And any concerns or questions you have, please raise them, and I'll be happy to address them. So if we can have the next slide, just going over the characteristics of I think we're starting with a bad investigation. This is hopefully what you will not see coming from the Inspector General or from the police department. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but as I say, if you have questions about any of them, please jump right in. Under narrow focus, I do want to say that the failure to obtain a complete narrative account from all parties involved is just a really critical component of a good investigation. And the failure to get that is an indication of a deficient investigation. And by that, I mean letting someone tell their story, just asking them a very general way, please tell me what happened. Just start from the beginning. And whether it's a complainant, a civilian witness, an officer witness, or an officer who is the subject of an investigation, you want to give them an opportunity to say things in their own words, to express themselves. And this is particularly important for a complainant because they are often bringing to this process a lot of emotion. They may have felt that they experienced trauma or they observed trauma, and recounting it, describing it may cause them to, in some sense, re-experience that trauma. So there's a lot of emotional content there. So you need to be the interviewer needs to be a very good, effective listener to recognize there's both an informational level in what someone is saying and also an emotional component, and to address both of those. And often I found complaints really want someone to listen attentively to what they have to say, make them feel that they're being heard. So that's a really significant element of doing an effective investigation and doing an effective interview. And then another point just under that, failure to address inconsistencies in an interview subject's account. People speak in general terms. They may have a sense of what they mean, but they may not describe it as specifically as we would like. In an investigation, you need to drill down to the specifics. What does someone actually mean? So if a police officer says someone took a fighting stance, well, what does that mean? Can you describe their body movements? Describe the positioning of their body? Where were their legs? Where were their arms? Where were their hands? What is it that made you conclude that they were perhaps preparing to fight? So that's just one example. Or if someone says the officer roughed me up, what does that mean? How did they contact your body? Which did they use their hands, fists, elbows, knees? Where did they contact you in their body? So getting that level of clarification is really going to be important, because when you evaluate an officer's behavior, you need to evaluate very specific actions. You can't address generalities. The regulations that govern officers' behavior describe very specifically what they should or should not do, and that is particularly true, I hope, in your training in the areas of force, in the permissible uses of force and impermissible uses of force. Under the heading of investigator makes assumptions about, often this can be a situation, and this can be based on their own experience, which is likely going to be limited. As someone who's grown up largely as a middle class white male, my experiences are definitely different from those of people who are African American or who are Latinx or who are women. So my perception of what might be plausible based on my experiences and the experiences of people I know may be very different from what a member of that community may consider plausible. So that's something you always have to keep in mind, that you're seeing things, the interviewer is seeing things through the prism of their particular set of experiences, and to recognize that other people may have a very valid alternative set of experiences that makes something seem very plausible to them that may seem implausible to you. So keeping those potential biases in check is very important during the course of an investigation. And then I just want to talk briefly about poorly done interviews. And one element of this would be differential treatment of, let's say, civilians from officers, being deferential to one and not to the other. I think it's important when you look at an investigation, is everyone treated with the same level of respect? So when I would read a complainant, I would often have their name and I would say, Mr. or Ms., how would you like me to address you? And unless they say, call me by my first name, I will address them as Mr. or Ms. Just in the same way when I'm interviewing an officer, I'm going to address them as officer, sergeant, lieutenant, etc. It's just showing that same level of respect and sensitivity. Another sign of a poorly done interview is that the investigator talks more than listens. You want the person you are interviewing to do most of the talking. It's their story, not yours. And if you get interruptions, the investigator talking too much, saying things that might imply the type of answer they want or their judgments or their perceptions, that's not going to be that good an interview. Obviously, an interview wants to establish some rapport, but they really want to let the interview subject tell their story. Another fault would be the investigator asking leading questions. And that's a question where the question itself kind of assumes an answer or suggests an answer, like asking someone, well, were you fearful for your life at that point versus how were you feeling at that point? And you sometimes see these in police interviews, internal affairs interviews. They're relating to officers and they're kind of sharing their thoughts. They can understand what that officer's mindset might have been, so they take a shortcut, and rather than asking the general question, they're asking the more specific question that implies a shared understanding of what that officer may have been thinking or feeling. And you need to eliminate that middle part. You need to let the person being interviewed say for themselves what was going on. And then would be a failure to obtain relevant details. So say people often speak in general terms. You need to drill down and say, what do you mean like that? Can you describe that more specifically? Just going into all the necessary details so it can be clearly visualized. So any questions about any of the characteristics we've listed here of what you would see in a bad or deficient investigation? Okay, then let's go to the characteristics of a good investigation. And again, this was all in the outline you got. I'm just going to jump ahead to the thorough element here and gathering all necessary documents and evidence. Now, this is not going to mean everything necessarily, but it's everything that's relevant and that addresses an issue or a question in that case. And we're going to show some examples of how you identify issues and questions in a little while when we go through a sample case. And then it mentions has a who would know under thorough, has a who would know approach. And this is a phrase I get from an investigative journalist. And the who can be a person, it can be a document, it could be a piece of evidence like a video. It's anything that can allow you to answer a question or clarify something that needs to be clarified in that investigation. So you need to be, it needs to be thought of in broad terms. And if you have a question, if you're unclear about something, what piece of evidence, who, what out there might give you more information about that to resolve that question in the mind. Under patient, respectful, and thorough interviews, I mentioned the emotional content, particularly for complainants, but for officers also. If officers have been in a situation where force has been used, where they've been in a struggle, where deadly force has been used, that can be traumatic for them. And so that needs to be sensitivity to that also, that recounting it may bring up emotions for them. So again, we sometimes think officers are, we neglect the emotional component of their work and recognize that they deal with a lot. And that when they discuss it, we need to be patient and understanding of what their experience. The patient, respectful, thorough interview, we'll use an inverted pyramid format. That's where you start very broadly, where you ask that very general question, and then you focus down. It's a term that comes from journalism, clarifying, asking more specific questions. So a good interview is going to follow that format. It's going to clarify gaps, resolve inconsistencies, and obtain sufficient detail so that the investigator can clearly have a sense of what happened, be able to visualize it in their mind. I will often say, okay, I want to be sure I understand this or that I'm seeing things as you saw them. So you were standing here and this person was standing there. And that's a way of just setting the scene, almost like a photograph of a film. It needs to be unbiased. We talked a little bit about our personal, sometimes unconscious biases, but there also needs to be identification of real or perceived conflicts of interest. That a good investigator will identify to their superiors and indicate maybe someone else needs to handle this investigation. I think the Columbus Police Department is large enough so that if one investigator, if one investigator in the Inspector General's office might have some type of personal, professional, familial relationship with someone who's involved in that investigation, they can flag that and maybe that will be assigned to someone else. So again, so there won't even be any perception of potential conflict. So any questions about any of the characteristics that were listed in the handout for what you would see in a good or effective investigation? Not hearing any. So why don't we go on? So here's the sample case we're going to use, and this is something that's made up, but it's designed to incorporate a number of elements that you might find in an investigation. And I hope you had an opportunity to review the summary of the complaint and the summary of the police report. Does anyone need some time to look at those? Okay, I guess so here we're going to talk about what the investigation should look like. What are the issues and the questions that come up just from reading the complainant statement and the police report, and what an investigation needs to be done to resolve those questions and issues, because clearly we have two different descriptions of an incident. So first of all, let's start with some of the legal questions and issues. And I think that's the next slide. So obviously we're going to have, and I would like as much as possible for all of you to participate, to kind of jump in and give me your thoughts on this. But we have two criminal offenses here. The assault on an officer, claim of wearing a hat. What other rules of force might apply here? Any thoughts about that? And if anyone is speaking, I'm not hearing anything.
Clarify your question.
Excuse me?
Could you clarify your question?
Oh, yes. So we talk about department rules on use of force. In this case, what type of force might we be looking at? What department regulations would we want to look at regarding specific uses of force?
We probably want to know if the use of force continuum was followed or what elements of it are relevant here to this situation, because there were multiple different types of uses of force in the incident.
Yes. Yes. So for each use of force, you want to see what the specific policy is on that. So we had several different uses of force. One, we had use of a taser, of an electronic control device. And most police departments have very specific regulations about the circumstances under which a taser can be used and how it should be used. Often they require a warning before the taser is deployed, giving the individual an opportunity to comply. Sometimes they require that there be a backup officer behind the officer using the taser. So if other force, sometimes deadly force, needs to be used, they will be prepared for that. We also have use of a baton, and there's an allegation that the officer struck the young man with a flashlight, and most departments have specific rules about when you can use an object other than an approved striking weapon, such as a baton, as a weapon. And typically, they will prohibit use of a flashlight as a weapon, except in very extraordinary circumstances.
So if I could interrupt
So
you,
then-
if I could interrupt you.
Yes.
So we really want to know today what we should expect in the reports that are coming to us from the Inspector General. So what we should expect, for example, in this particular case, is that they have specifically laid out the elements of the use of force. That's not something we're just supposed to know. It should be included in the report that comes from the IG's office to us. Am I correct?
Yes. Yes. So a good report is going to identify all of the allegations, and we're going to go through those in a little while. And for each allegation, identifying the very specific rule that would apply to that behavior. So as I say, here you would have a separate allegation for use of the taser, a separate allegation for use of a baton, separate allegation for striking with the flashlight. And so you want to make sure that all the allegations are specifically included, that it's not generalized, it's not just saying use of force, but what use of force was there. And that's something that should come out in the summary of the interview with the complainant, having them describe in detail the force that they believe the officer used, and some of that might be reflected through other evidence, let's say through medical records, if you obtain those.
I had a question also. It looks like to me, and I could be wrong, but at least what I recall from, thank you. What I recall from the use of force continuum, even the first interaction with the officer, he never asked the
And I can't hear you. You faded out.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, from my recollection of the use of force continuum, at least here in this instance, there was a contact from the officer grabbing the young man and pulling him out of his seat, even before any verbal directive was given to do so. And so I'm wondering, I mean, I'm assuming then we should also see that, like what's the trigger to even initiate any contact if we haven't had a verbal warning? Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. And many departments, I haven't looked at your department's use of force policy. Many of them have a de-escalation policy talking about before you go to a use of force, using effective verbal commands or oral communication to avoid the use of force. And I think we could probably agree with that better communication in this instant perhaps could have avoided any use of force, that there were very quick escalation in terms of officers' conduct, as opposed to allowing some type of communication. I think we could all see some alternative ways this could have been handled, that would have probably been more in conformance with good policing. And sometimes you have to recognize there can be a difference between policing which is less than ideal, that might be deficient, and policing that violates department regulations. Sometimes you're going to find officers act in a way that's complies with department regulations, but was not the most effective way to handle a situation. And that is not something that they could be disciplined for. It's not a violation of department regulations. It might be something involving some counseling or training, something that would be non-disciplinary. Maybe the training has not been as effective as it should be. Maybe it hasn't been communicated properly. So those are good points. So then we want to look at rules on summoning backup, on reporting and documenting use of force, rules on use of profanity. Most departments have some prohibition against use of profanity. So let's talk about just some of the factual questions and issues. So let's start with what happened before the contact between the complainant and his friends and the officers. So what are some of the questions that you would that the investigator should want to know about what had happened even before there was that contact? Any thoughts on that?
I have a question, and I'm not sure I remember. I'm not sure I remember. Was there a call about wearing hats?
There
Why
was a
did they
call
go
about-
to this particular individual?
There was a call about a disturbance in the theater.
Okay. And it ended up that individuals were wearing hats. And lots of people
I'm
were
sorry.
wearing hats.
Yes. The complainant said that the officer told him to show her some respect and take off his hat. The call was about a disturbance in the theater, and the officer's report said that the manager told them that there was a group of young African American males who were making a disturbance in the theater, that they refused to leave and threatened an employee. So those are all things that the officer is asserting, but those would be questions. Did those things happen? So it's very important to determine what information officers have when they arrive at a scene. What information do they receive through communications, over their mobile display terminal, in their car, and also with whoever they talk to at the scene before initiating contact with someone who might be detained or arrested. So here he's talking about the manager gave him information. Well, that's something, in any individual statement, you want to look for elements of it that can be proven or disproven. That again might reflect on their credibility. So investigators should talk to the manager and say, what did you tell this officer? Did you tell him you wanted him to take any particular action? Is the officer's statement accurate? And the officer may have simply gotten it wrong because it was rushed and he didn't remember properly, or it could be inaccurate for another reason. So those are all things you want to look at. Have they been asked to leave? Because at that point, if the manager, as proprietor of that property, says, I have asked someone to leave, they have refused, they are trespassing, that gives the officers a authority to say, you have to leave, as opposed to if the manager said, we just have a problem in here, they're being noisy. That could be resolved in a number of ways. So those are all things you want to look at. The claim is the officer says that he was told that they threatened an employee. Did that happen? That employee could be interviewed to determine whether in fact that happened. Often when officers respond to a location, their mobile display terminal may list information about previous incidents at that location. Particularly, let's say if they're going to a home where there are police have been there before and they know there are firearms, or there have been previous calls of domestic violence. It varies from department to department, but that's something to know what information your officers in the Columbus Police Department would have when they respond to a scene. Then there are characteristics of the location, the size and dimensions of the theater, the lighting, the auditory characteristics. You'd want to know what film was being shown. Is this a blockbuster film with a lot of gunfire and explosions? Is it very loud? So that reflects on, could other members of the audience hear what the officers were saying to the complainant and his friends, assuming the film was still going. If it was very loud, someone 10 rows back may not be able to hear what's being said there. Then we have the interactions in the theater. So any thoughts about the questions that would need to be resolved based on the complainant statement and the officer's statement about what happened in the theater once the officers arrived?
And I hope you can hear me, but in the summary, it says that the officers could hear them from the back row. So are you suggesting, like, in the middle of an investigation, we should ask other people who were in the theater, were they causing a disturbance? Did they disrupt them, or could they hear them from that far back, and not rely solely on what the officer put in the statement?
Yes, absolutely. If there are others present, you don't want to rely solely on one person's account. You want to get all relevant information. So as I said, you don't want to get everything. You would not need to interview every member of that audience. But if you could identify some members who said they saw or heard, you would want to find out what they saw or heard. You'd also want to have an understanding of where they were in relation to the complainant and the officers. Where were they seated? You want to get a sense of the distance. So you might want to visit the theater and maybe take some measurements. Is this a traditional theater with rows one behind another, or is it stadium seating where the seats are maybe 8 feet apart? So that would be relevant in someone's ability to perceive, ability to see, and ability to hear. So yes, absolutely, you don't want to take either the officer's description as being absolute or the complainant's description. You want to gather other evidence. That's what the investigation is about. So other thoughts on some of the issues and questions that the investigation should address in terms of that interaction between the young men and the officers?
Question that comes to mind when the officers told them that they were causing a disturbance, and they said, the young men said that no one had said anything to them before. But it seems that according to what this says, the person who was making the call to the police complained about them making a disturbance. So that's something that will probably need to be cleared up as well, whether there are other people in that particular theater that did hear them being asked to be quiet or not. So I just wanted to bring that up too.
Yes, absolutely. And you would want to talk to the theater manager and the person who supposedly gave them a warning. If that person said, yes, I did talk to them and they were continued to be loud and insulting. If the young men say, no one asked us to be quiet, but you do have evidence that someone did, well, again, that's going to reflect on their credibility. So it's, what could potentially prove or disprove any element of what someone says. So we have a number of things. Were they yelling profanities? How did the officers address the young men? What instructions did they give them? You have two differing accounts of how force came to be used, of the physical actions of the young man, the complainant, and the officers. So some of those things were, did the officers swear at the complainant? Did they order him to get out of his seat? Did they try to remove him from his seat by grabbing him? What were his physical movements if they did grab him? How did he get out of his seat? And then one of the most, the circumstances of the taser use. The officers claimed that he attacked them. What did other people see, both his friends and members of the audience? And then perhaps, the most significant allegation here is the use of force on his arm. But before that, because of the lacerations to his head. We have two very differing accounts of that. The officers say that occurred accidentally because he hit his head against the seat bracket. He says that's because the officer struck him in the head with a flashlight. And all the police departments I have, whose rules I've ever looked at, specifically prohibit strikes with an impact weapon to the head. They usually state there are certain permissible areas of the body where you're going to strike, those areas where they're not bones. Those are more soft area of the bodies where essentially you're going to get someone to comply through application of pain with an impact weapon. But you're not going to strike someone in the head because that can cause some very significant damage. So the allegation of the strikes to the head with a flashlight would be a very serious use of force. So that would be one of the significant questions. So again, one of the questions would be the location of the struggle on the floor, the proximity of his head to the seat, and then very important, and this would require a visit to the theater, what do those theater brackets look like? How is that seat held down? You'd want to get photographs of that. You'd want those to be with a ruler in it, because often if you can get medical records and you can get photographs of injuries, you can take them to a medical expert and say, what are these injuries consistent with? And here we have two potential causes. We have a seat bracket, which probably has a very specific physical signature, physical design, and you have a flashlight. And my guess is that a competent medical expert, if they had photographs of the injuries and medical records, could say this is consistent or inconsistent with one of those. And that's going to be very powerful evidence because that's more objective evidence. The witness statements, you can say, might be subjective, influenced by ability to see or hear, or you can claim that his friends might be biased in his favor, the officers might be biased in terms of their account. That objective evidence would be really important in a use of force case like this. So then I'm just going to go through some of the rest of it kind of quickly. So the actions outside the theater, actions in the ambulance, the complainant's behavior statement, and the statements of the officer, statements the complainant and the officers made to medical personnel. When that ambulance arrives, the complainant said, they hit me in the back of the head with a flashlight, that's a contemporaneous statement. And that's something you look at in assessing credibility. Is someone told a consistent, someone's statement's consistent throughout, their interactions with others. And that's very close in time. They're saying that to people who are going to be providing medical care. So they would presumably want to give them accurate information about where their injury is. Versus what did the officer say to the ambulance personnel about the cause of the injury? Again, you would need to have a HIPAA release to be able to talk to the medical personnel. The reporting of the events will be relevant, and you should have a separate department regulation on how reports are supposed to be completed and how force is supposed to be described. Some departments require a separate use of force report. That might require gathering of evidence by a supervisor, let's say a sergeant who might have to respond to the scene and take photographs, talk to people, write a summary report of their own. Documentation of the officer's injuries. They claim they were injured. Was that documented by observation or photographs? And documentation of the complainant's injuries. Were photographs taken at the scene? So some other issues you would want to look at. Any thoughts on some of the broader issues that this raises that you want to resolve? So one of them. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. So typically, what do you see as a timeline then for investigations that match kind of this best practice in terms of thoroughness? Like, how long do you typically see maybe an incident just like this? Might an investigation take from start to finish?
It really varies on the workload and the staffing, but it is really significant that you get perishable evidence in a very timely manner. So that means if an incident if there are CCTV cameras, you want to get to that very quickly because it may not be retained for a very long time. It might be retained for 48 hours, 72 hours, 10 days. If you have any inkling that there might be CCTV cameras, maybe inside the theater, outside if something happens out on the street, which is where most interactions do, one of the first things you should do is go to that location, look for cameras. With Google Street View, you can often do it remotely. And if you see something, you want to get out there immediately and contact whoever is in charge of the recording device and get a copy of that recording, because that may not be there much longer. And if you have witnesses whose recollection is likely to fade or maybe more difficult to locate them or to interview them, you want to get to them quickly. So it's a matter of prioritizing things. So we'll go through that a little in the investigation plan, but I'll just kind of run through some of the things you'd want to look at. As they've arrested him for wearing a hat in the theater. Okay, what is the law on that, and how often is that enforced? Has it been enforced in any movie theater? Have these officers ever made an arrest for that, or is this really selective enforcement? One of the things you look at in any cases of biased policing based on race, ethnicity, other protected categories, is disparate treatment of similarly situated individuals. Here, a similarly situated individual would be other people in that audience who are wearing hats, other people in any other movie theaters who've been wearing hats. Have they ever been arrested? Have police ever cited people for those? You'd want to look at the comparative size and strength of the officers and the complainant, the officer's tenure, their training, their prior experience, potentially the complainant's medical history, history of injuries, particularly of the injury to the arm. If the complainant had sustained an arm injury 6 months earlier, and this arrest may have aggravated that may be different than this arrest actually causing that injury. So let's go to the investigation plan. And so these are some of the things you're going to, that investigators should
May I
get.
ask a question, please?
Yes.
So
Yes.
what you're saying is that in some of these cases, the IG's office is going to be having to hire medical experts, and in some cases, medical experts to review the evidence?
I don't know
that-
what the situation is there. In San Francisco, I would take those records to our medical examiner, who is a medical professional. They do a lot of autopsies, and they would be able to review the medical records. I'd sometimes taken them to the emergency room physician because they deal with a lot of trauma injuries and get their opinion. So they would not necessarily have to hire someone. It really depends on who might be available in your area who could provide a fair, unbiased evaluation of that evidence.
Thank you.
But it might mean hiring an expert. Again, it's going to depend on the severity of the use of force, the severity of the injury. In this case, if an officer did strike that young man with a flashlight and then claim that he hit his head, but I think that might be cause for criminal prosecution. So that could be very serious, both for the use of force and for falsification of a police report.
So I have
So-
a question to follow up with that.
Yes.
Because there was another incident within that scenario, and it was also with his snapped arm or something like that. And there were two different descriptions about how that happened as well.
Yes.
So would that follow a similar process as the lacerations?
Yes, yes. You'd want to get the medical records. Presumably that might include an X-ray. Now, again, you can only obtain those with the consent of the complainant. But you could take those to an expert. Again, that's why you would want to visit the location and see, is there a step that he might have fallen on? What is the ground like? Is it heavily carpeted? And you could take all that to the expert and they could say, no, this is not consistent with someone falling, and they probably want to know the person's size and weight. This could be consistent with application of force, such as pushing someone's arm up behind their back. Yeah, that would be very relevant as well. Very serious potential use of force.
I have another question. I'm
Yes.
trying to fix this in my mind. How do we go from police being called for a nuisance, for people being a nuisance, and then all of a sudden now they are arrested for not refusing to take off a hat? So I'm trying to wrap my head around that.
Yes. Well, I made this unusually complicated, so it would involve a lot of elements. So here that would be an element of what they say, what police might call failing the asshole test. Someone is not sufficiently respectful or deferential to a police officer. The police officer decides, this is an asshole, and I am going to take action against them because of their attitude, or might be called failing the attitude test. That's improper. Police are not supposed to treat people in a disparate manner solely because of their attitude. And that's an element we're showing here. That would be bad police work. And that's why you would want to know how often this law is enforced. Is it very selective application of that rule, where suddenly they're going to cite him or arrest him for some very minor, obscure, perhaps out-of-date violation because the officer didn't like the way he addressed her, didn't like his attitude?
In this situation, the female officer made it personal by saying, show me some respect. And then this use of a hat business became a felony assault on a police officer, which in Ohio is a felony too. and which ruins a person's life. It doesn't get pled down, and is a mess. I mean, realistically. So this became a little incident being loud in in a theater to a felony assault on a police officer.
All right.
I mean,
And
there's
that's
so
why
much
this-
to this thing, yeah.
Yeah, that's why this increasing emphasis on de-escalation, on using verbal skills to calm a situation, to not escalate it, not make it confrontational when it doesn't need to be, where an officer's handling things differently in the communication style, because, hey, let's just step out here. This isn't going to be a big deal. Not becoming defensive, not feeling that you have to unduly assert authority. It's verbal skill that officers need to learn. And if they're going to go in there with a chip on their shoulder and saying, if someone isn't respectful to me, I'm going to be personally offended by that. It's poor police work, and it's likely going to escalate to a violation of regulations and possibly law. So I've made this scenario fairly extreme to include a lot of those elements. Hopefully, we would not see something like this happen in Columbus. But unfortunately, in some locations, it has. And in my area, the Oscar Grant shooting on BART is the most tragic example of that, where some young men were involved in some incident on a BART train on New Year's Eve. They were taken off, and one of the young men, they were African American, used the N-word. And one of the officers there repeated that word back repeatedly and unnecessarily escalated that situation, and involved in a young man being shot in the back and dying. And I put a lot of the responsibility on that officer who did not fire the weapon, but the officer who kept using the N-word and just escalated that situation when it could have been handled very differently, and probably everyone would have gone home that night. So these are just some of the documents here. As I mentioned, use of force report, names and contact information for audience members, and think about who would know. How would you identify those audience members? Well, some of them might have bought their tickets online with a credit card. So I believe you do have subpoena power, or the Inspector General should have subpoena power. That's something you would need to get through subpoena from the theater. Or because there was a disruption of the film, theater management may have offered passes to
Excuse me, we don't.
Oh, you don't? Okay, I'm sorry. Well, that's something that it could be requested. You couldn't compel it if they wanted to give that voluntarily. But some of the theater goers could have talked to the complainant's friends afterwards, said, we didn't like what happened to your friend. They might have gotten names from them. Some of them, as I'll mention later on, might have filmed it with a cell phone, might have posted that to social media. So that's something the investigator would want to search for, because any videos are going to be very relevant. Now, I haven't even mentioned police body-worn camera footage. I don't know, do Columbus police have body-worn cameras?
Yes.
Okay, then that would be one of the very first things you would look at. Even if the theater were dark, those cameras would capture the audio, the verbal interaction there. And they might capture some of the force, again, depending on the lighting conditions. Different cameras have different sensitivities in low light conditions. But that would be one of the first things an investigator would look at here. So, then just a list of some of the other potentially relevant documents. When I started in this work, I did ride-alongs every weekend for about 9 weeks. And every time officers started to fill out a form, I'd ask, what is that? Where does it go? Can I have a blank copy of that? Because I wanted to know every form they use, because those are the structural, you could say, girders of an incident that document how things happen. And so you want to know what documents to look for, what they're going to tell you, what they should look like, and what will key you into a document that was not properly prepared, or that is missing information, or that is a red flag. And some of these documents, such as the use of force report, could be very significant red flags. So I think we can go to the next slide. And these are just some other things I'd mentioned, the dispatch records, records of arrest for wearing a hat in the theater, records of arrests by officers for assault on an officer or for resisting arrest on the part of these officers. Sometimes officers will charge someone with resisting arrest as a way to cover potential improper use of force. So if an officer is repeatedly arresting people for resisting arrest and those cases are dropped by the district attorney because they realize that there's little, if any, merit to them, that can be a red flag. And that's something that sometimes will come up in early warning systems, but that could be something to look at for these officers in terms of their background. Had they made multiple arrests where there was the use of force while they charged someone with resisting arrest? And the next slide. And then we talked to some of the physical evidence. We've gone over a lot of this. For this case, given the issue of the striking in the head, you might want to have someone seize that officer's flashlight to see if there were DNA evidence on it. Again, because the striking in the head likely could be a criminal prosecution, probably a felony. And the next slide. So we have, I think some of this will be common sense. Complainant's companions. We mentioned the theater manager. What did he tell the officers beforehand? What was his perception of how the officers handled this? How did that compare with any other incidents where they'd had to summon police? The theater employee had contact with the complainant and his friends, the audience members, potentially the projectionist, the paramedics, medical personnel who treated the complainant. In San Francisco, someone with serious injuries would not be admitted to the jail until they've been taken to a hospital and medically cleared. So in addition to the ambulance personnel, you're going to have the ER personnel to whom the complainant may have made statements. The officers may have made statements. They may have made observations about the injuries. And then the jail personnel who took custody of the complainant. What statements did he make? And beyond that, people who might have been in the holding cell or the jail cell with him. Again, contemporaneous statements. What did he tell those people about what happened? If he told consistent stories throughout, that's going to bolster his credibility. And the next slide. We mentioned social media for photographs or the postings about the incident, videos on YouTube. And the next slide. Oh, do we have so this is something I like to put together. This is a very powerful way to display the evidence. So this would be a matrix of what different individuals say about the incident, about significant elements. So from the left-hand column, we have, were the complainant and his friends yelling profanity? That's a question we want to answer. Were others in the theater wearing hats? Did the complainant punch or kick the officers? And we have various people's account of that. And then injuries to the complainant's head. And you can see you get consistency there. One of his friends says he saw the officer smash the complainant in the head 20 or 30 times. Often people will overestimate the number of blows. Again, because it's an emotional situation, there may just be focusing on the fact that someone is being struck. But then you have the manager who's saying he saw the flashlight beam jerk back and forth quickly. That would be consistent with that flashlight moving up and down, consistent with the young man being struck with it. We then have two witnesses who saw things consistent with the complainant being hit with that flashlight. So when you put the evidence in this format, it's a good outline for when the report is written. And so a good report is going to contain statements from all these people, and it's going to emphasize what they saw regarding that particular allegation. Here we're talking about the allegation of the strike to the head. And that, again, that would be an allegation. Based on these witness statements, that would be a sustained allegation. Any questions about that before we go
I
on
would like to
to?
interject something here.
Yes.
One of my questions, if I was using that witness matrix, would be, were these individuals wearing hats when they entered the theater? And if so, was anyone trained, was the staff trained to let individuals know that they cannot enter with a hat on? You know,
Yes.
and I did not see anything like that in this scenario.
That would be a very relevant issue. Yes. The whole issue is what is the law on this? How is it ever applied at all by the police, by the theater staff? And again, that would be one of the things you would want to ask the manager about what they told police, what the rules are, what they asked police to do. Yeah, it's similarly situated individuals. Or is this just absolutely selective enforcement? Is this something the female officer pulled, pun intended, out of a hat because she didn't like his attitude and decided, I'm going to arrest him just for the way he's talking to me, just for the way he's acting? And that escalated things. So yeah, is there any justification for, in this case, that would be a detention or citation, an arrest, and things escalated from there. But excellent point. And that's one reason you would want to talk to those theater personnel. Other questions or thoughts? Okay, let's go through quickly what to look for when you're reviewing a complaint investigation. And the next slide. So we talked about this. Is complainant allowed to tell their story with minimal interruptions? Well, they asked open-ended and clarifying questions. Was all the relevant information obtained? Now, this would include things like if they mentioned their witnesses, contact information from those witnesses. How can you get a hold of them? Not just ask the witness to contact me, but the investigator wants to know how they can directly contact that witness. Description of each officer and each officer's specific actions, any documentation of injuries, their awareness of any recordings of the incident, because nowadays everyone has a cell phone and people are filming things all the time. Did you see anyone with their cell phone out? What did they look like? Where were they? Just the fact that people did have their cell phones out is something relevant. If there's CCTV footage, you might be able to get a still of that individual, walk around the neighborhood and try and find them. That footage is going to be very relevant, and because body-worn camera footage is useful, but it only shows one perspective. Often they're mounted on the officer's chest. It's not showing what the officer saw. It's often very close up, so it may be moving around a lot versus someone who's standing off to the side with a cell phone video, maybe getting a broader perspective. Again, you need to be aware any video is showing things from only one perspective. And that may not be a completely accurate, truthful representation of what was taking place, but it is really important evidence. And the more videos you can get, the more perspectives you have. Was a complainant asked to sign a medical release to get medical records? Were they asked appropriate closing questions? And one of those should be, have you discussed this incident with anyone else? Again, those contemporaneous statements. Have the statements been consistent? So who did you talk to when? Summary of discussion. Did they post anything to social media? Did they write this up anywhere? Then I always end every interview, is there anything we haven't discussed that you think I should know? This is an opportunity for someone to say, oh, I didn't mention this, or you didn't ask me about this. And then lastly, if you remember something, please contact me. We've all had the experience. We talk to someone, we have a job interview, whatever, 15 minutes later, where he said, oh, I forgot to mention this. That's going to happen to the witness. You want to really encourage them to recontact you. That's what a good investigator wants to do, because they want all that information. So I think the next slide, we're going to talk about investigator assignment. Was the investigator free of potential bias due to involvement in the incident in some way? Were they present at the scene? A relationship with any involved party that could be perceived as compromising the investigation? So again, family, personal, romantic relationship, outside business relationship, or a close work relationship. In smaller departments, it can become more difficult to exclude officers who might have worked with these, but hopefully Columbus Police Department is large enough. And since you have an inspector general, they are not working with the officers. That's one of the great advantages of civilian investigators. They're not part of the police agency. They haven't gone to the academy with anyone. They haven't been partners with any of those officers. They are coming in from completely outside without any preconceived ideas about what different officers are like or who they like or don't like. They're bringing in a very unbiased, detached perspective. Did the investigator have adequate time and resources to conduct the investigation? If this is something like the case we're talking to about here, you may want to have multiple investigators working on this because there are a lot of things that need to be gathered quickly. The theater manager and staff, potential CCTV videos. If it's something like this, you want to devote the adequate resources to it in a timely manner. So I think go to the next slide, investigation plan. Here we talked about each allegation being clearly identified, each action, and identifying the relevant department policy or laws that would apply to that. Again, that should be reflected in the report. Did the plan identify the relevant records, evidence, witnesses, and investigative tasks, along with a timeline, prioritizing what do you need to get right away, who do you need to interview first, who may become unavailable, whose recollection may fade, who can you wait to interview. Typically, you're going to interview the witness officers before the named officer. You're always going to interview witness officer before the named officer, but often you're going to interview the named officer last, after you have all the other relevant evidence. The plan should be reviewed and approved by a supervisor. It's going to change as the investigation goes on, as you get more information. If you find audience members who have relevant evidence, that's going to add elements to the plan. It's something that's going to be fluid. I'm just reading this. So was all the evidence obtained properly documented? You want to establish a chain of evidence. Were any gaps in the investigation documented? Were failures to obtain evidence explained? If you request documents, you don't get them, you must send a follow-up request. So for instance, the theater attendance, you can request it, you can follow up, but if you don't get it, you have to explain that and say, they said we're not going to release it without a subpoena. And then the next slide. Okay, I think we talked about that. In San Francisco Bay Area, we audio recorded all of our interviews. All officer interviews were recorded. California is a two-party consent state. Both parties have to consent to an audio recording. So unless a witness refused to be recorded, all those witnesses were recorded. That gave us a permanent, very clear record of what was said, how the questions were asked. The interviews would be transcribed, and often the transcriptions would be attachments to the final report, to the summary. And then the next slide. So these are some of the things you talked about. Yes, all the relevant evidence should be summarized. Each witness, you should have a narrative account that kind of sets the stage, where they were, what they saw, their ability to perceive. Were all the allegations addressed? We talked about that. policies and rules, because when you decide, when the report recommends a finding, it's going to base that finding on the relevant rule or law, applying that rule or law to the evidence. It should have all the sufficient and relevant evidence. It should have credibility assessments, sometimes for each individual, evaluating why they are or are not credible. Is there anything that causes questions about their credibility? Did the evidence support the findings? And I assume you're probably using a preponderance of the evidence standard. That typically means more likely than not, or 51%. There are some legal definitions of that, but that's the kind of simple, straightforward definition. So I know I covered a lot quickly. Questions about that?
Yeah, I've got a question. So thanks so much for the presentation. So one of the challenges here is kind of like, what happens after the report, is made, the findings are made, a recommendation is made. What are some of the challenges that you have seen in kind of your experiences on whether it's policy change or whether it's discipline or anything like that comes up based on the reports that come out? Just wanted to get a sense from you all on what some of those major challenges are in terms of taking recommendation into action.
Sure. I can cite a few based on personal experience, and then I think Cami will have something to contribute. One is supervisory accountability. Both more supervisors present, but you have to recognize that officers, first-line supervisors have a great influence on how officers behave. And if officers are behaving badly in a kind of blatant way, it may indicate they're not particularly worried about repercussions from their supervisor. One bad supervisor can infect quite a number of officers in creating a lax culture where certain types of behavior is tolerated. So I've worked in agencies where we will hold supervisors accountable for the behaviors of their subordinates. If it's something they should have known about, if they have failed to properly train those officers, if they have missed warning signs. It may be due to training. Typically, officers go through field training. One bad field training officer can teach multiple officers how to do things badly in violation of department regulations or relevant laws. So supervisory accountability is one thing. Ensuring the training is appropriate. Policies, and that's a whole broader issue. Cami may have some broader perspective about that, about getting policies changed. And then discipline. You want discipline to be consistent. And the agency I worked at most recently, the Oakland Community Police Review Agency, had a disciplinary matrix where a list of all the offenses pegged to specific rules and the range of discipline for a first offense, for a second offense, and for subsequent offenses, because you have progressive discipline. And at our agency there, when we sustained allegations and completed a report, we had a separate disciplinary form that listed mitigating and aggravating factors. Some mitigating factors might be lack of experience, a comparatively new officer who hasn't had a lot of experience. Whereas if it were an experienced veteran officer and they violated a rule that they should know about, you can consider that an aggravating factor. Mitigating might be commendations, other good police work, versus aggravating could be prior disciplinary actions, similar complaints, frequent auto accidents. There could be a range of things that they feel would be indicators of poor performance. And you would have to list those and specify each factor, provide information about that. And then that would be used, the director of the Community Police Review Agency would meet with the chief of police and the command staff, and they would discuss appropriate discipline. And the police department might begin information we didn't know about. Sometimes it might be something relating to stresses in the officer's life that could be causing poor performance. But they did want to ensure that they were applying discipline consistently, because in some agencies you find that when officers challenge discipline, they will say, well, no one else who's committed this type of act has ever received this level of discipline. So why are you treating me more harshly? And in that case, maybe other officers were treated more leniently, but there may have been mitigating factors there. So that's why those things, it may be useful to document those things. But Cami, I think, has other perspectives on challenges.
So I think Jason did a great job of outlining the challenges. I think that from a board's perspective, one of the challenges, and from the IG's perspective that we see across the board in civilian oversight entities, is how people respond to the outcome of your review and any recommendations that you make. So in this part, when you're looking at, you're essentially waiting for misconduct to occur, having an investigation done, reviewing that investigation, all of that is a fairly reactive process. But there's also this part of civilian oversight that is very important. There will always be a reactive piece to this, but the proactive piece is equally, if not more important, because it helps prevent future misconduct, whether that's by recommendations of policy, procedure, or training, or if it's by doing audits and finding inconsistencies, for instance, in discipline. So one of the things that we see that are implemented to kind of help in those challenges are the requirement of written response. So for instance, if you see things that happen in the investigations and the incidents that you're reviewing, and you make recommendations from them, putting those in writing and having the person, whether it's the chief or some other designee of the chief, respond in writing as to whether they agree with the recommendations and they will implement them, or they disagree with them and why they will not, and why they disagree with them, is a really important record. And then that being able to be part of annual reports. So there's kind of a history of the change you're trying to make, the things that continue because certain changes aren't happening, or what happens when those changes are made, making sure that there's a continual record. We know several entities across the country who not only make recommendations, but then they follow up on those recommendations with additional audits to see if any of the recommendations actually made a difference, and how they could be further tweaked to maybe make additional changes down the road that could help improve the system and help improve policing, not only for the police, but also for the community as a whole. So I think I could probably go down that rabbit hole further, but that's a very kind of general umbrella statement of what I see as one of the most important pieces in this process to continue addressing what could potentially be great challenges.
And I also think you can look at each sustained case and as kind of from a failure analysis perspective. Why did this happen? And how can this be prevented in the future? The way a department might review vehicle collisions. Was this due to a bad policy? Was this due to lack of traffic control? Were the officers going too fast? Department have a great interest in not being involved in collisions. So what factors led to this happening, and how are you going to avoid it in the future? And also piggybacking on the issue of policies, it's not just auditing to ensure the policy has been implemented, but ensuring that it was proper training was done. And a really good example I can give of this is in San Francisco, we had a policy changed on language access, requiring that officers not use a family member or a friend at the scene to translate, but that they get a certified interpreter present. And there are certain officers who were certified. And they found that the training on that had not really sunk into officers because it just seemed so easy for them to have, another family member. And this was particularly true in domestic violence incidents. So our agency, the agency I was working for at that time, actually helped the department produce a training video with scenarios demonstrating why and how getting someone who did speak, was certified to interpret, could make a significant difference in enabling them to do good police work. And they used an example where domestic violence incident where the wife did not speak very good English and they didn't have a good interpreter. So she really wasn't able to communicate what had actually happened. The man who did speak good English got the officer to believe his version. And they contrasted it when you get a good interpreter in there. You see it's very different. You have grounds to make an arrest here and prevent this from reoccurring. And they brought in some of the officers who specialized in domestic violence to talk about how important that was for field officers to make sure they get the full story, because they did have mandatory arrests and they wanted to prevent this from happening. So that was a very effective way of following up on the training and ensuring that this policy was properly communicated to officers. Just sending out the written training bulletin, and officers have to certify they read it, doesn't mean they understand it or that they're going to follow it.
Jason, my question is, the police departments that you worked for, were they represented with collective bargaining agreements?
Yes.
So you had also then a grievance procedure and rules of the collective bargaining agreement that you had to adhere to too?
In California, we have a California Peace Officers Bill of Rights, which governs how investigations are conducted. And it means that the officer has to be advised beforehand of the nature of the allegations. That doesn't mean you have to give them the entire complainant statement, but you generally will tell them the date, the time, the incident, and you have to tell them what the allegations are. That, we're going to question you about allegations of unnecessary force, use of profanity, unwarranted arrest, unwarranted detention, things like that. They have a right to have a representative present. They have a right to audio record. And departments vary in terms of the policies on allowing officers to review body-worn camera footage before they're interviewed. Sometimes that's listed in collective bargaining agreements. Sometimes it's just a matter of department policy.
Thank you.
Is there a question over here? Yes.
I just wondered, this may go beyond the scope of this training, it might be another training, but inasmuch as, most of this is going to be handled by the IG, do you have recommendations for board relations with the IG? That is, what are the things that you've seen that lead to really good IG oversight? Much of this is not what the board, this is great for us to know in a general way, but it's going to be the IG that's going to be running down almost all of this. And so we're going to need to work well with the IG. Do you do a separate training for that, or do you have just general principles for, look, in order to ensure that this is being done, here are the sorts of things that we recommend for civilian oversight boards?
So Jason, I'll jump in on that.
Excuse me.
if you don't mind.
Before you
Yes.
answer the question, I'd like to just to give a perspective. We will be reviewing their work. And so I just think that what we've received today will put us on solid footing on what we should be looking for. That's
Yeah,
that's
thank
all.
you.
It's
I
more
wasn't
than just
attempting to
information.
minimize, the importance of what we're doing or that we're not going to, but, most of it is going to be a review of their work as opposed to us actually engaging with witnesses or many of the documents.
And I absolutely agree, but
Yeah.
it will also give us the ability to critique
Yes.
their work, which could be very important in this process.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry for the interjection, but please answer his question.
No worries. So I think, so there are lots of examples in the country now of where we have inspector generals, or sometimes they're called monitors or auditors, and perform very similar functions, and boards. And I will say that how they interact with one another is very important. It can be the difference between function and dysfunction in a civilian oversight entity. And you do have this amazing ability to almost provide an additional level of oversight in the process. Even those who conduct oversight should have some form of oversight to make sure that they too are performing the work in a fair, consistent, effective manner. The best way that this is often dealt with is through very well-written policies and procedures that address the relationship between the board and the IG. And a lot of that sometimes comes from an ordinance or a charter amendment itself. Sometimes those are a little vague on the relationship, and so it requires some filling in the blanks. But I do think that having that outlined so that everybody knows what field they're playing on and who is responsible for what becomes very important. So that is, there's lots of training that we could do that talks about how different jurisdictions have addressed that. But I also think there are ways to provide examples of operating procedures. And then also, one of the most wonderful things about the oversight community is that they are very open to providing information and very giving of their time for conversations about specific issues. The job is hard enough. No one wants anybody to have to reinvent the wheel. So as issues come up, maybe the issue is how the IG and the board interact. We're happy to always help connect you with people who, in addition to what we might be able to provide, can also tell you, well, this is how we handled it specifically.
And 2 points I can make. One is someone who's worked in 2 investigator model agencies and has done a lot of other types of investigation. This is a very difficult type of investigation to do. One reason is you really don't have a constituency. I did criminal defense investigation for a long time and had a nationwide organizations that supported the work we did, public defender offices. And here you're caught between 2 entities, the police department, which is very cohesive, very bonded. They have this unique shared experience, members of the community, and often the results of the investigation will displease one or both. They'll be unhappy with you. So you don't necessarily have a lot of support. So what I would say is be supportive of the staff of your IG's office. They're doing a difficult job. As I mentioned, the emotional content of talking to complainants, investigating these complaints, watching body-worn camera footage of people being arrested, of force being used, has an emotional effect on people. My wife has told me, you need to use headphones because I don't want to hear people screaming. From body-worn camera footage. So be cognizant of that, maintain good communication with them. From the perspective of someone who's worked in human resources and worked at the San Francisco Controller's Office, I found that they every year did a climate survey of their employees, and that's often used for organizational development purposes, just to gauge the morale, needs of employees, how they're viewing their resources and management, doing an anonymous survey. If you have a staff, I recommend doing that on a yearly basis. And some agencies also do surveys of complainants and officers, but as essentially the agency that will be overseeing the Inspector General's office, it's a good way of just gauging where people are at, how they feel about their jobs, and what changes might be made to improve that agency. And unfortunately, sometimes you do have leaders of oversight entities that are not doing as good a job as they could, and the employees are the ones who know that first. So it's a very useful tool to use, and probably your Department of Human Resources can put something like that together for you. Probably have people in organizational development. But be aware of the morale there and the need for support and appropriate training and recognizing the difficulty of the job they're doing, and establish appropriate lines of communication.
Is there another question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me now? There we go. All right. In your experience in working with other departments and using this program, when it came to actual disagreements between the IG office and the board, and when those disagreements were vast, how were those ultimately, or if not, resolved to your, I don't know, in your opinion, historically?
So I do think that we have seen jurisdictions where there is disagreement between a board and whether it's an inspector general or an executive director of an agency, conflict sometimes exists. I think one of the things that is helpful is if in those policies and procedures, how conflict is handled is laid out to a certain extent. I know that some of that will also depend on the how your organization is enabled legally. But I do think having that laid out of how conflict can be handled or should be handled is really important, so that it helps to take some of the emotion out of it, because you are working in a very emotionally charged subject matter. And I think also when conflict arises, getting information perhaps from outside of your jurisdiction on the issues that are, for lack of a better phrase, the sticking points, is really important, so that can provide perspective to the situation. I can think of several specific incidents where additional perspective might have brought better understanding by the monitor of the board's position, and also providing better understanding of the board of the monitor's position. So I think having something in writing about process, but then also knowing that going out and getting additional information and better and more perspective on any particular issue is always a good line to take.
And I'll say, understanding how the investigations are conducted is really valuable, to the extent that that information can be presented. I worked for an agency where a board was critical about why more cases were not being sustained. And I think it's important to understand how the investigation is put together and how the case is put together and what's required to reach that standard of ponderance of evidence where you can sustain something when you look at all the evidence. And it's a laborious process. It's somewhat boring, but it's really useful if you can get some examples. I love kind of the Grand Rounds medical Grand Rounds equivalent, where you take a case and say, you presented here the facts, here's what we looked at, maybe a much more expanded version of what I did here with cases that aren't as complex. So you can see the trajectory of how the evidence was gathered, why decisions were made on, what investigation to pursue, and how, when you summarize that evidence, you come to a particular finding. I think that's the more you know about how things are done, the better you'll be able to understand it, the better you'll be able to appreciate it. And that's a challenge I faced when I started doing this work. I wanted to learn as much as I could about policing, That's why I did all those ride-alongs. I wasn't going to be a police officer, but I wanted to understand enough about it so that I could effectively investigate it and come to evaluations about behavior, about actions.
Thank you. Thank you for all of the information that you shared. You all gave a really thorough, I guess you could say, presentation on how to conduct an investigation. And so we are at the process where we will be receiving completed investigations from the Inspector General's office. And so what I am interested is seeing what type of recommendations and or suggestions that you have of things that we should be looking for as we complete the review of their completed investigation.
Well, I think some of those are in the outline, where I talked about, and I don't know if you will be getting interview transcripts or just summaries of interviews, on whether you will be getting investigation plans or just the reports, but trying to look at, you can almost create a checklist. Were all the allegations identified, including allegations maybe not articulated by the complainant, but that are violations of department policy, recognizing that a complainant is not going to be aware of the relevant department policies or laws that officers might have violated. And a good investigation will include those, because from a managerial standpoint, if officers are violating the rules, you want to know that and you want to address it. You want to keep it from occurring. So all those allegations need to be in there. All the rules need to be identified. Was the evidence gathered? Was it gathered in a timely manner? Were all the body worn camera footages reviewed? Were all the records reviewed? Were there inconsistencies between them? And if so, were those inconsistencies resolved? Or were they left unexplained? That would be a sign of a poor investigation. So I can probably go through this and create sort of a checklist for you that I'll have Cammie send you.
Please do.
And pulling that out. But just to understand how an investigation should be done, we'll be able to look at, say, okay, did they do it properly? Did they get all the evidence? Was it unbiased? And again, I don't know if you're going to be able to review transcripts. If you can, it's very helpful to see how questions are asked, because often it has been proven in studies that the way you ask a question can influence the answer. And so even if you're not asking a leading question, poor questioning can influence the answers that are given. That's going to influence how the summary is crafted. So a good interviewer needs to ask the questions in a very open but comprehensive manner. And that's something you really won't know unless you can listen to those interviews or read the transcripts yourselves. Or if the summary is extremely detailed, like saying, when asked X, someone replied, quotation mark. And that's something I would often include in my summaries, because the way someone responded to a question, it can be very telling. Best example I can give in sexual harassment investigations. You ask someone, did you proposition this woman? And the person says, hey, I'm married. That's not answering the question. And you say, again, did you proposition them? I would never do that. Again, they have not answered the question. They've deflected. So inclusion of that type of detail is important in seeing, did the person pursue the information they needed, or was the person trying to be evasive and deflect?
What do you recommend that we get from the IG so that we can do a job? Because summaries are kind of, I was a public defender and I had to review a lot of summaries, and summaries are kind of ineffective in a way, in my opinion, unless they are, like you said, really thorough. Otherwise, they're just kind of a summary of what the narrator believes. So what, in your opinion, would be what we should be getting from the IG so that we can do our jobs?
Well, I don't know whether they will routinely transcribe interviews. Increasingly, that is being done. It is somewhat costly. There are services, rev.com, that can give you a machine-generated transcript, which can work if people enunciate very clearly and don't use a lot of proper names. It's not something you would want to rely on in court. That requires a personal transcription. So again, I don't know what the budget is for that, but increasingly I've seen a trend where reports that have a sustained finding will have transcripts as attachments or as available. Because if they are going to go to a disciplinary hearing, at least in California, the officer has a right to those recordings or transcripts in order to defend against the charges and against the discipline. And in California, we may have multiple levels of review. It may go to an arbitrator, or potentially to court. So the more detail you can get, the better. But I would want to get an understanding of how your IG is conducting its interviews, how they're documenting them, whether it's just everything is summarized in the report, or whether there's a running case summary of all actions taken in a case. So for each date, you would list requested such and such video, or such and such a record, or contacted this witness, left a message. I didn't really get into due diligence about you wanting to show affirmatively that you made a multiple affirmative attempts to contact a witness. That might be phone, email, letter, in person, a combination of those. So I like to see all documentation of all those steps, because it shows that if you didn't have something there, you made affirmative attempts to get it.
So no, thank you for that. And I think that checklist is going to be especially helpful. One of the questions I have relates to, I think was mentioned earlier, about some of the challenges between the IG, Civilian Review Board, oversight, also just the challenges within the community. A lot of the big controversies are going to occur over issues of excessive use of force, especially issues that potentially involve a criminal investigation. So how do you all, how have you seen in different jurisdictions how either the IG or the Civilian Review Board, whether the board itself or individual members, basically posture and communicate with the public about, obviously not going into details on ongoing investigations, but how do you navigate some of that? Because that's something that immediately, any situation that occurs, you have political leaders who will issue statements, you have the police department that will issue statements, and I think the Civilian Review Board and the IG's office were, in a newer situation in which, the posture towards and with and communicating to the community is unclear. So I just wanted to get a sense of what you've seen in different jurisdictions.
So the first thing I would say is, one of the most important things is to make sure that you have something in place before you need it. A lot of times things are going smoothly, particularly when a new entity is getting up and running. And so you're focused on things like investigation review and policy and procedure recommendations, and how does all that work? Communication and community outreach need to be very important, so that the community knows who you are and knows what you can and cannot do before you ever get to the moment of crisis. Now, that's difficult because sometimes community only cares what you do when there's a crisis, if we want to be very real about it. But putting that information out, making sure that what you do is in a very accessible manner on your website, so as people are looking for answers, they're coming to you rather than someone who thinks they know what you do. And I think those pieces, so coming up with a communication plan. Also, when there is a crisis, it's hard because you don't have all the information you need to give the community what they want right away. They want answers. They want you to tell them that something, they want you to tell them what they want to hear often, because they are, many of the community is upset, many are grieving, many want action right away. And so part of it is also just communicating that we hear you, we know this is happening, this is the process going forward, and when we have more information, we'll be back, so that you're not just absent. But having that policy and procedure about what is said when and who will be able to say it ahead of time is really important. That way you don't find yourself in a very kind of backed into a corner, and having to start from scratch with the community in the midst of a crisis.
And the more transparent you can be ahead of time about the IG's procedures, their investigative procedures, and the various steps, the better. Some agencies, most notably Seattle, I think it's Office of Police Accountability, where they have kind of an interesting system, multifaceted oversight system, but they have a civilian who heads their internal affairs unit, and their operations manual is online describing how investigations are done. So that's very useful because then you can say we're proceeding per our operations manual, which is on our website, through these steps. And obviously, police officers are public employees, and public employees have certain rights regarding disciplinary matters. Except in extraordinary circumstances, they cannot be disciplined without an investigation being done. So you want to have that out there ahead of time, so it won't look like an exception is being made in this, tragic, traumatic situation. That you're following consistent policies. San Francisco Police Department has a policy where after any officer-involved shooting that involves an injury or death, they have a online community meeting within 10 days. They release the body-worn camera footage. They provide a scenario of known facts at that time. They describe the multiple investigations that are going on, and members of the community can weigh in. They're typically held in person and now online as well. So that's been a good policy to present information, but obviously that's within 10 days of an incident. The investigation has not been completed at that time, and the criminal investigation takes priority in California, probably in Ohio as well. Officers cannot be compelled to give a statement in a criminal investigation. They can in an administrative investigation upon threat of discipline, and the statements they give in an administrative investigation, because they're compelled statements, cannot be used against them in a criminal investigation. That's why there typically needs to be a firewall between the criminal investigation and the administrative investigation. And that's why the administrative investigation may follow the criminal investigation. And that's an important nuance of law for people to understand, that there's a difference between whether an officer might be prosecuted criminally or whether they might be disciplined by their police agency for violating their policies.
Excellent. Thank
One
you.
other thing I would add just very quickly is that I think I mentioned about making sure the public understands what you do, what you can and cannot do. I think it's also important to understand that you need to consider all stakeholders when you're talking about educating them on the work that you do, and working collaboratively with the IG to provide that to all stakeholders. So that includes not just going to community meetings, it also includes making connections with law enforcement, elected officials, government employees. The list goes on, but you have to make sure that you understand that it's education and information that goes out to everyone and not just certain sectors of what we would consider the broader community.
Yeah, and that's especially important for law enforcement because, as I mentioned, one advantage over civilian oversight has is we're not part of that old boys network. I say boys because police departments traditionally have been predominantly male. But officers may feel internal affairs in the past have treated officers unfairly based on who's in favor, who's not, who knows someone. And civilian oversight is separated from that. But if you don't explain your procedures to them, that gap will be filled elsewhere, maybe from conjecture or word of mouth or by the employee association. So in San Francisco, we had a list of frequently asked questions for officers on our website, describing our procedures, what would happen when they got a notice for an interview, what it meant when they were noticed as a witness versus when they were noticed as an officer subject to discipline, how allegations were crafted to take some of the mystery out of that. So it would be right there in black and white. When I did ride-alongs, I would always ask for the opportunity to address the roll call and say, and this is in the early days of the agency, I'd say, you may not be happy that we're here, but we are here. We want to do as good a job as possible, and you may not like me, but at least if you're not going to like me, do so with some knowledge about who I am and who we are. And I would explain a little bit about the procedures, then answer any questions I could. And they appreciated that level of openness and candor. Because as I say, otherwise, you're going to be a mystery to them. It's going to be opaque. The more transparent you can be to all your stakeholders, the more credibility you will have with them. And that, as Cami said, starts before an incident. It starts with your formation and your ongoing operations. So I think it's very good to just have any type of open communication you can with people. And that includes the officers. They are a constituency, they're a stakeholder.
Jason, I had a question. So in talking about the priority of the criminal investigation over the administrative investigation, you also brought up, though, the need to preserve certain types of evidence that would be used in the administrative investigation, i.e. videos from closed caption cameras, all of those things. How do you suggest, or what best practices have you seen for preserving that information, even if the administrative investigation is going to be subsequent to any criminal investigation outcomes?
Sure. I assume that for any, let's say, officer-involved shooting, in addition to the IG investigating, internal affairs will be investigating as well. So there should be, the IG should have
Depending on
some
the shooting, excuse me, here in Columbus, and we have 2 of these cases now, actually, the criminal investigation is completed by the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, which is a part of the State Attorney General's office. They complete an investigation, and they submit their report to our county prosecutor.
Okay. So the IG, I would hope, would have some protocol established for how those investigations proceed along parallel lines. And maybe it means that all information obtained in the criminal investigation will flow to the IG's office. Because as I say, it can flow from criminal to administrative. It cannot flow the other way, where the officer is given a compelled statement. So if they are going to go out and get those videos in a timely manner and then provide them to the IG immediately within a certain time frame, I don't know whether the IG would be allowed to sit on the interviews that they do or to observe them. The protocols vary. Some allow them in the room, some allow them watching from video and writing out questions suggested. The protocols really, really vary. But you don't want to put the administrative investigation on hold while the criminal investigation proceeds and potentially lose evidence. Criminal interviews may be somewhat more narrowly focused than administrative interviews because they're looking at was there criminal conduct, whereas the administrative investigation is looking at the policies and the strategy and tactics and a whole range of other things, de-escalation, oral communication, reporting to communications, use of appropriate weapons, a whole range of things that are governed by department policies that would not be criminal violations. So those interviews may be more detailed and lengthier. So except for the interviews with the subject officers, I think they can be separate interviews, but again, they may be joint interviews. I just don't know what protocol your IG has worked out.
I think that's a really good point. I think especially around, I mean, this was one of the questions that we weren't sure about was if there is going to be an ongoing criminal investigation, what the IG does while that's happening. And so it seems that you all are obviously suggesting a firewall situation when it comes to, certain information flowing right into the criminal investigation, but not necessarily putting an investigation on hold while, is that correct there?
Yes.
Okay.
It could be entirely possible that an administrative investigation could be completed before the criminal investigation is, before whatever the prosecuting agency makes a decision
Interject,
on whether
I'm
or
going to
not.
interject. I think it's going to be, and I was already, going to do this. We as a board need to go back to the statute that created us and to, once again, and I've already asked the city attorney's office to do this for our next meeting so that we are very clear as to what the IG can do and when, because I think what you're describing is something that we cannot do as set forth in our statute. And so rather than just kind of talk about a scenario that quite frankly doesn't fit Columbus, I would prefer that we go back, utilize our legal representatives to make it very clear as to what we can do. Because it's my understanding that essentially the administrative investigation, and I don't want to use the term stayed, Mr. Tobias had a term, but it is essentially stayed until the criminal investigation is over, sent to the prosecutor's office, a decision is made by the prosecutor as to what to do. So quite frankly, it's a very lengthy time. I just read, and I don't know what caused this, but I think it was Attorney General Yost, that for BCI, it typically takes a total of 400 investigative hours before they complete their investigation. But again, I think we're just getting into an area right now that it's not going to be applicable to us, and I'd like to go back and absolutely make sure what we can and cannot do.
Kind of quick clarifying question on that. I mean, can we get some additional detail there in terms of what the IG can and cannot do? Because
Yes.
I agree. I mean, generally, if that's not within the statute and they can't do it, that's one thing. But I also am interested generally about best practices around the country, and if there are situations in which there's ongoing processes, then I think it's helpful information to have. But I also would be interested in what the exact process is. Is this a best practice matter? Is this a completely prohibited by law matter? Those are the questions that I had remaining.
Well, let's go back to those questions, and depending on the answers, then we can decide what we need to do.
Yeah.
So, for example, if we think that we can, then we can come back for the best practices. But I would prefer that we not go there today. This is not going to be a one-time conversation. I'm not sure if we've completed our membership requirements for NACOL, but we are going to be members. We are going to have additional, trainings. And I'm not sure if you can see us, but Dr. Chanel Jones, who is seated to my right, actually chairs our Training and Education Committee. And one of the things that we would like from you very quickly is that checklist, because at our very next meeting, which is November the 3rd, we would like to have her present that checklist and we have a discussion about it. And so we were going to be so grateful for you in terms of putting that together for us. Are there any other questions? Then on behalf of the entire board, we are so grateful. I mean, I've changed the agenda today because I didn't want to interrupt. This has been such crucial and critical information, and we thank you for being with us today. And something tells me it is not going to be the last time that you join us. So again, thank you very much. Any other comments? Then at this point, it's 4:08. We're going to take a break until 4:20. I know that's short. We do have a hard stop at 5 o'clock, and I will share with you now that I'm going to change the agenda, so it will not be the same when we come back. Again, thank you so very much.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
It's been a pleasure being with you today.
We're adjourned until 4:20. Council, don't leave. need to reconvene. Oh, I'm sorry, it wasn't on. So we're going to reconvene, and I'm going to stand unless I'm completely throwing you off back there. Am I good? You're good. Okay. Good? Great. Well, that presentation was certainly informative and insightful, and it's going to cause me to change to do some things. So I want to share with the board that the IG has completed 13 investigations and submitted investigative reports. So my thought was today that I was going to distribute those, not the actual reports, we're going to do that electronically, but I had an actual listing of them, into the subcommittees, and we would probably look at them in November. We're not ready for that yet. We need some additional information and I'd say training. So I checked with counsel. The IG has a time frame as to when complaints must be investigated and concluded. But when they come to us, we don't have those requirements. So for now, we're just going to hold on to those 13. There certainly might be more. And then at our next meeting, this is what we're going to focus on, but I'm also going to ask board members, you might want to add something else. So we'll get from our folks from NACOL the checklist. And I've already spoken to Dr. Jones. She doesn't have a date, but her training committee will be meeting next week. We'll be meeting next week. And in addition to this, as we work with NACOL, she may or they may be identifying additional training that we need as we go forward. And then, and actually this came about as I watched the last board meeting. I had already asked the city attorney's office, I called it a flow chart, but it's not a flow chart, to really go back and to look at kind of all of the critical points and timeframes, and now to even include, to Mr. Strickland's point, when can certain things occur? I mean, that's not something that I had included before, and so we know that the IG, and the board did this at the last meeting, you instructed her to, I guess, start complaints in 3 cases, not necessarily expecting them to move forward. But now it seems that there's a possibility that maybe we can. We need to fully understand that. And so I'm relying, and in addition to the cases with BCI, a clear understanding with internal affairs. So as I understand it from the 3 shootings that occurred in August, one was not referred to BCI, but there could be a real possibility that internal affairs could start a criminal investigation of that charge where a weapon was discharged but no one was hurt. What's the communication between internal affairs and the IG so that the IG's office knows when something has happened? And I think this probably comes back to what should be in the policies of the Inspector General's office, the SOP. And so we need to have a much better understanding of all of that. So before we start looking at cases, we are very, very, very comfortable. In addition to what I just shared from the board members, are there other things that you want us to be prepared for at the November meeting?
Yes.
I'm sorry, yes.
Yes, as we're putting together this flow chart, Chair, it would be really helpful for us to have a sense of timeline expectations regarding if this is stayed. I don't know. We'll talk about that in November. That was our understanding last time, that that the administrative procedure had to be stayed. Now we're opening it up and saying, well, maybe not, maybe there can be a firewall or something. But if it's stayed and we're not able to run a parallel track, what is the timeline that we can expect, our review to begin, given that BCI needs to complete their investigation, they're backed up? How, I'm hearing 400 hours, but I don't know 400 hours from what, may I finish? And then once they get done, how long does that wait with the prosecutor before the prosecutor gets moving? Because as we're going out to these community meetings and we're communicating to the public, here's what you can expect from your review board. And they're thinking that this review board is going to be looking at these cases within months. And really, we're not going to be looking at the cases within years. That's a problem. And so it would just be real helpful for us to have a realistic time frame for when exactly are we going to get these officer-involved shootings from August, so that the public knows this civilian review board is probably not going to look at that until March of 2024.
So even if we look at it, when can we act on it? So I have been doing a little bit, I have not spoken to BCI. It was my thought, and I talked to, I think it was actually Laura Baker, about the feasibility, and I'm not sure which meeting, of having two parties come in, BCI and the prosecutor's office. Have not talked to BCI, but I did have a conversation with my former colleague, Judge Janet Grubb, who now works for, and I think leads the criminal division of the prosecutor's office. She said she could come, but not until December, and I hope she doesn't mind that I just kind of share some numbers with you. Right now, they have over 200 individuals who are waiting trial on murder charges. They get 7,000, I think she said, indictments a year. And the cases that they are currently trying are from 2018 and 2019. And so I understand your point, and that's one of the, as I was listening to the last meeting, thinking we need to really get an understanding of that and to be able to share it. And so again, another to have a clear point. So if the IG is moving forward with an investigation during the time of the criminal investigation, what can really be done with that until the criminal matter is completed? Because she could be investigating, and again, I don't know, and so I want certainly clarity around that, because I don't believe that a report could come to us to take action until the criminal matter is over. And Pastor, you are absolutely correct. We could be talking years. I'll just use this as a little bit of an example. This was before our time, but there were two cases, as you will vividly recall, from December of 2020.
Casey Goodson.
Well, there are two. And
Yeah.
those cases, both individuals, I believe, have been indicted for murder, but their trials have not gone forward. And so one of the reasons I wanted to do this was to bring about some realistic expectations of folks. Because I do think that many in the community believe, well, this has happened, and the IG can do her work, and the Civilian Review Board can do theirs, and it's going to be over. So I just want us to be well-informed, have a conversation, what can we do, what we can't do. So that's a big part of, and we can certainly add this. I don't know if, maybe the city attorney's office can. I don't know if we'll be able to fill in the blanks with BCI and prosecutor. I just don't know. But we will try, because it's important for all of us. Anything else to be added at the, yes, Kyle?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the expectations in terms of timeline, what can be done in terms of reports and recommendations on that end. But my understanding that there is also nothing that prevents this board from making other recommendations as it relates to policy change, as it relates to patterns and practices that are not just maybe about one individual case, but about patterns that we identified. So I do think I'd be interested, obviously, in what the track is specifically as it relates to investigations and what the parallel track and timeline is. But I also want to think about our own standards and procedures and practices on how we are how we can operate in a more proactive manner. Because I think the concern that I have is that instances occur and we're just kind of like there's an ongoing investigation and there's no further discussion. I think we've got to figure out a way in which we are proactive in spaces that we can be. So that's just the other thing that
So I'm going to appoint you chair of the proactive committee. I'm serious. I mean, I've heard this, but then it gets to be, I mean, there's a reality about us being an all-volunteer board, not wanting to interfere with the Inspector General in terms of what she's been going through. So I probably have heard this recommendation before, but what does it really mean? So if you will accept, for right now, being a chair of one, then I think you should delve into that and to come back and to share with us. Are you willing to do that?
Look, I'm happy to. I mean, part of the proactive committee, this conversation is about what we do with completed investigations, right? I know we're going to talk about this come November, but I want to be proactive to get moving. But short answer, sure, happy to.
If I may,
Yes.
I would suggest that you also contact the IG and see what her plans are with regard to reporting certain proactive things to the board as well. I think she's planning on doing that, doing review of completed investigations to determine whether or not there are policies and procedures that continuously get
Is this
broken.
will this
So
be a
that
part
would
of the SOP?
I hope that it will be a part of the SOP.
I'm not going to put you on the spot, Inspector General, but I'm going to need a date for the completion of the SOP, because I know they're not completed. And so when you submit your report to me the end of this week, I want a date, okay? Thank you. Anything else on this topic?
Just one quick point as the proactive committee member here. There are going to be some standards and procedures that we put out and we place and put in place, which are going to be helpful. My understanding also will be that as things come to us as a board for the first time, kind of talking about these things, there will be additional questions and thoughts of actually, no, we want it done this way. And then I think just clarity on whether or not it can be done this way or what the different processes will be helpful. So I just wanted to, get the standards in place, but also have the flexibility for questions to come that could be expected. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that I should just give, the board a heads up. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but I am beginning to feel that monthly meetings may not suffice in the next 2 or 3 months. And I know that I'm looking at going into a holiday, season. Not making any grand announcement today. Maybe can wait until November to see kind of where we are. But I think that we might. I want to just pass on to the chair of the training committee that we received an unsolicited proposal for training coming out of Detroit. And so I'm just going to hand that to you. Thank you. One other thing that I wanted to share, this was communication that came to me, and I have shared it with Chair Younger in terms of community engagement. I received, communication went into the Inspector General's office, but it was directed really to me. There are a group of, I think there are 4 women that have been involved in a YWCA project, and they essentially decided to take us on as a project in a way. They're concerned about our community engagement in terms of sharing, with the community and what we're doing. They actually sent out a survey to members of the community, and I don't know how many individuals were surveyed, but they received nearly 50 responses, which was pretty good. They're going to be happy to share with us their results, but what I was most interested in, they have some questions, and one of them certainly is, what are we doing around social media in terms of engaging the community or sharing? And so I'm going to, I did speak with Gretchen Geyer today, who has been chosen as their spokesperson. I'm going to give this to Chairwoman Younger, and she's going to work with the IG, and they're then going to respond to that communication. This was a very positive thing, to have someone reach out to us. These, and I'm going to say young women because I think I know the program, they're in a specific program at the Y, and this is what they chose to use. We only have 20 minutes, and we still have on the agenda both the IG's report and a report from the Community Engagement Committee. I don't know if I had any, the only other thing that I think I wanted to cover was to say thank you for the flexibility of moving the meeting in November. For those who can't come, I do apologize for that. But I want a specific reminder that our meeting is going to be November 3rd, which is a Wednesday, and it will not be in this space. It will be, I guess you would call it next door across the, pardon? Thursday. Oh, I'm sorry, Thursday. Thursday at 2 o'clock. So is it November 4th? What date is it? Okay, November 3rd, Thursday, not in this space, but in the garage conference room, is what I would say. So I'm going to first turn to community engagement, and I'm going to make a confession as a board member. I have not volunteered to attend any community engagement event, and that's not a good thing. And I'm not going to put anyone else on the spot to say if you have or if you haven't. I did make a request of one of my neighbors, but I may turn to the other neighbor, that when he's going to go to some, if we could piggyback it so I could catch a ride. So I'll give you the opportunity also, Reverend Tatum, when you go to one, I can catch a ride with you. But I would just encourage the board members, if you've not volunteered, Bethany sent out, it's been a while, and I don't know, I could maybe if we could do an update and even, are you going to cover that topic in terms of the board attending?
Very briefly.
Okay, you take it.
I'll do it.
Okay.
All right. Very briefly here, yesterday I met with Jarrell Black, who is the new community engagement person with the IG's office, and he's wonderful. I mean, he's going to be introducing himself, so I'm not going to say much, but he has a lot of good ideas, and we discussed where we're going to, how we're going to do it, but we're going to be going to rec centers and starting with the churches and then different other things. So, but the way we're going to be doing this is just the way Bethany has been doing it. Jarrell will give her all the agencies that he's been in contact with, and I'll be getting in contact with some agencies. And then she will send an email out to the full board, and you may volunteer if you have the time, and then she will let me know who has volunteered, and then I will pick 2 or 3, whatever the situation, 1, whoever volunteers, and then she will let them know, and give them the information so that we will have, so someone from the IG's office will be at those meetings or town halls. And someone from the IG's office and then someone from the board will be there. We've gone, so far, on September 1st, we went to Northeast Commission, and Willard and myself were present, and the IG spoke at that one. On September 20th, that one I've already covered with you, so I'll move on. We went to the South Linden Area Commission. Pastor Tatum was there, and they were really happy to have us there. The Inspector General made a presentation there. They were all very receptive, asked many questions, and when they left, when we all left, some of them were also leaving, followed us out. They said they would be attending our meeting here and asking questions. So these things are really good. They do want us out in the community, and so we're going to be getting there. The September 22nd, North Linden was rescheduled. Now, we have one tonight, October 4th, at the Northland Community Council. 40 people are expected to that one, and the IG's office is going to that one. Of course, the IG makes all these presentations, and they're concise and well done, and gives all the information that they need, and literature is passed out. And Mark Fluharty will be going tonight, and then I'll be going to that. And then Thursday, October 6th, there's the North Central Commission meeting. Mac and I will be going to that. If anyone else wants to come, just let Bethany know. And then the only other ones that we have scheduled is October 18th, the Mideast Community Meeting. That's Far East Neighborhood Pride. If anyone lives out there or wants to go, please let Bethany know.
I can go to that one.
You can? Okay. Bethany? Okay, thanks. So you will be receiving emails from Bethany. So if it's in your area and you have a little bit of time, it's good to have the board join the IG, because people are going to, and especially when we start with the rec centers, the churches, and other organizations, they do want to talk to us, and they want to hear what we have to say. So that's it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to attending one. Okay. IG, you have 7 minutes. You do very extensive reports. I would suggest that board members review the reports. If you have a question, reach out directly to the IG. I know you wanted to make an introduction, and I think that's very important. And if there are 1 or 2 very important things that you want to have us, to point us to, please do so.
Only thing I really want to do, okay, so, all right, I'm gonna be really quick. I think it's important to really introduce, is it on? You just press the button? Okay. I think it's really important to introduce the community relations coordinator for the board, really. So I'm gonna have him introduce himself, tell you some of the social media and things that he has already established. He's amazing. So here, come on. I'm sorry. This is Jarrell Black.
Can everybody hear me? First and foremost, I would like to thank IG Hendricks and Deputy IG Blunt for this opportunity, and thank you guys, the board, for your time. My name is Jarrell Black. I'm born and raised here in the city of Columbus. I'm a proud graduate of Bishop Hartley High School. Just to give you guys a little background on what I've been working on. So social media has been established with the IG's office. We are now on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I have also created a QR code that you can directly connect to our complaints. As reference to Mrs. Younger and what she was speaking of in regards to our town halls, I would like to dip into our Parks and Recs programming, which is crowds that are already built, and establish town hall meetings. This will be after we attend all of the commission meetings, which is right around the end of the year. We'll probably go once a month with town hall meetings. That'll give the opportunity for our community to come in and hear what we have going on. I know that these meetings are usually during times while people are at work. It will give us a great opportunity to get out and get the word to our community. So those are just some of the few things that I've been working on in just the 2 weeks that I've been here.
Welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. IG, is there anything else you want to share with us today?
No, I think I'm good. You have a PowerPoint presentation, so if there's any questions, I tried to do a breakdown. I think the last time the board asked me when we closed cases if I could do a breakdown, so I tried to do that. I am available if you have any questions, and again, we do have a town hall, not a town hall community meeting this evening if anybody wants to.
And again, not really knowing the flow of future meetings, but it sounds as if the one in November is going to be jam-packed. I think when you are thinking about reports to us, you may consider that you may not have the opportunity to actually speak with us. So if there's just one or two things that you really want to pull out, hopefully the board is going to be, okay with that. But we're going to have to prioritize what we get done in 3 hours.
Yeah, and then just kind of a quick question. That ahead of our, the next meeting, but before then we talk about these, there's several closed investigations here. Do you have just a quick high level so that we know what we're about to be looking at?
I read 8 of them, and I think there are 13. I went over and read them. And let me just share, I can absolutely say to you that nothing like what you heard today. They are pretty straightforward, fairly, I don't know if I want to use this term, simple, succinct, nothing complicated, that's the best, But they're really, would you concur with me, IG?
Yes, I tried to make sure that the reports that we wrote, what the conclusions were, that we explained to the board what we looked at. So if we looked at body cam footage, it notes that. If we looked at police reports, it also notes that. 911, CAD reports, we put all of that. What policies and procedures, those are footnoted in there with the reference so that whatever the conclusion is, the board should be able to see what the facts was, what the evidence is that we looked at, and the investigators, even when they looked at the body cam footage, some of the footage, if they were talking about it, you'll notice some of them footnote the exact, what was that? I want to say video sync. So if you were looking at the video, you would know exactly where that video part was that they looked at. So our goal is to make sure that we provide enough information, let you know where that information come from, so that you can see what our findings were, so that you would concur with that. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us and we'll make sure that we're able to answer that questions. All of that information is in the file. It's extensive, but if the board wants to review that, just let us know.
Yeah.
Well, and I would suggest, since I read the 8, I would ask that you and your team go back and you take the information that you heard today, and you may not, but you may want to make some adjustments in terms of how you're conducting your investigations. Again, I'm not saying that you should, but that's why I wanted your team to be here, so that you could hear the presentation, made to the board. And again, best practices. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Kyle, did you have another comment?
Yeah, so just, I think it would be helpful, as you complete that, obviously the information for us as well, but just, I don't know if you all will in the future be doing any sort of press releases or anything like that, like when those come up, because I can imagine that people are going to wonder what happened in a particular investigation if they ask further questions. So I was just a question there. I don't know if there's a way to or a way for there's us and then like general public at a high level summary of investigations received, all that information. Are you all planning to do any of that as well?
What I can tell you is that the reports that we present to the board, we have presented to the board, and we are waiting for the board's approval before anything from my office would be released, because my understanding is, again, we serve at the pleasure of the board. These investigations we do are for the board to review and to approve, so nothing will be released from our office unless the board has agreed that they want that to be released. It would all be based on the board.
Okay, so I think it's helpful, just something for us to think about proactively to make sure that when folks ask questions about these things coming up, that maybe we figure out a way to fast track process so that summaries are submitted sooner. Thank you.
I did want to make one announcement, and just so that if the public's looking, we are moving. We will be moving into our new space. So the office will not be accepting in-person walk-ins because as of tomorrow, everything is coming in, it's going to be broken down, and we're moving into our new space. So that'll be West 50 Town Street. We are available if anybody wants to make phone calls, hotline calls, but we just can't take any walk-ins while everything is being broken down and moving to the other location.
Walk-ins.
Monday. Monday, we'll definitely resume, Mark. We are available. I mean, anyone can call us if they're trying to make appointments, but we just want to make sure that the public is aware that we will be moving into our permanent space.
And I believe Ms. Ross?
Excellent. So that was one of my points, that she already established the protocol for that. But if you all, the board, are interested in viewing body cam footage, there's a training that the board has to do, as well as an MOU that the board will need to sign with CPD in order to be able to do that. The IG's office has already done that. I did not feel it appropriate for the IG to be signing anything on behalf of the board, so we excluded the board from that agreement. What that means is, before November, if you all want to get that done, we'll need to fast track that process. So if you could let Rob know, and Rob and I will get it handled for the board as quickly as possible.
So is this done individually? Do we have to come up with a time? You said for training, right?
Training was done individually, but virtual, correct?
Yes.
And it's something you can
Okay.
get done fairly quickly.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. So board members,
Few hours of training? Just what are we talking about by training?
IG, will you give a quick?
Okay, so one of the things, in order to review the footage, is that you just have to go through the training because of all of the information. I believe the training, I know you put me on spot. I know, see, just, how many hours was that, like? One. Okay, so it's just a couple of hours, and it is virtual, so you'll be able to log online, look at that, and, but I believe the thing of it is that you are only able to view that from a city agency, so you won't be able to, you have to be attached to the city network in order to review the body cam footage or the cruiser video.
The footage itself, but not the training.
Right, not the training, but the footage, yeah, you won't be able to review that from a remote location. You'll have to come in. And if that's something that you want to do with our office, we'll make sure that we have a computer and everything
well,
set up.
let's get the training part first.
Yes.
Okay, because we can't see the footage if we don't have the training. So Bethany, could you send out, to the board, and I don't know if it's only certain times that it's available, but if you could get the specifics for us, for what we need to do, and to get that to the board, then we can move forward. Okay? Yes.
Are your investigators taping the interviews with the witnesses?
The interviews with witnesses are being recorded.
They're being recorded, okay. And are they in person, or some in person, or are they?
Let me go back, I want to clarify, because you said taping and recording, and it could be the same thing. Is this just an audio recording, or is it actually one where it's visual?
It's audio recording.
Okay.
Audio? Okay. And they're being kept in case we need to listen to them
Yeah, they're being downloaded into the file.
in the file? Okay.
Yeah, they're in the case management system.
And are the interviews by telephone, or are some personal interviews? How is that? Is there a policy that you have?
Some are on the phone, some are in person.
Okay.
Depends on the investigator that's
Okay. All right.
conducting the
Thank you.
investigation.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions, concerns? Motion to adjourn? Second?
Second.
We are adjourned.